now what I do is I take the data that in most cases scientists have produced, and then I make it useful in terms of policy recommendations. So I'm making the next step now, which before I had no control over.
I feel like I'm having more personal impact, and actually I'm being involved in lots of different areas of science.
I suppose we kind of went into it without any training whatsoever, and I think because of the research PhD that I did in chemistry, that wasn't really that daunting at all. We just went and ordered a load of books off Amazon and read them.
Okay, so I did my PhD in the geology department at Cambridge University. I was studying how the ocean circulates in the Atlantic and how that was related to climate change. I found it really interesting and I loved doing my PhD, but for me, I felt that there was enough evidence that climate change is happening and actually we just need to get on and do something about it. So I decided that policy was the area that I wanted to go into. I must say, I did do a postdoc as well, so it took me a little while to come to this conclusion. And then I went on maternity leave, so that again added a bit of extra time, but it gave me some thinking time to work out exactly what I wanted to do. And I applied to several jobs, but I ended up doing an internship for 6 months at an NGO called BirdLife International on their climate policy team, which gave me the additional background and skills that I needed to then apply and get my job at DEFRA. So I've been there now just over 18 months. So when I first started, I applied to quite a generic recruitment round, and I was placed in the international trade team, which was not my background. So even though it was really interesting, I worked on a lot of interesting areas, I looked for a job in other policy areas. So I'm now working in the soils and peatlands team, which is directly related to climate mitigation, because we want to preserve our peatlands in the UK and stop them from emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of work at the moment on restoring peatlands, also sustainable management of lowland agriculture that has been on peatlands. I don't know if you've been to East Anglia, there's a lot of peatlands there that have been farmed for a long time. So there's a lot of different areas that we're looking at restoring sustainable management. And I think that, and the other area of my work is preventing, hopefully stopping the use of peat in compost. So this is working with industry, growers, compost manufacturers, retailers. So hopefully in January we'll be talking to them about the options that we're considering for policy mechanisms to stop them using peat. So it probably was very helpful to have an internship because there wasn't a lot of responsibility at the beginning. I was able to sort of go into an open plan office, which was quite a new experience for me, having been in an office of 2 people for nearly 10 years. So that was interesting, and also then working in a team and delivering something with a team was something that was very new to me, because I'd been an independent researcher for a long time. But also an extremely exciting experience and very varied with different time pressures. So it was helpful to have that introduction before then going kind of full speed ahead into a full-time job in policy. So civil service jobs and particularly DEFRA, I didn't want to live in London. There are a lot of government departments that have hubs outside of London, so DEFRA is one of those departments. There's a hub in Bristol and a hub in York, so I decided I wanted to live in Bristol, so yeah, that was part of the decision. I don't know if anyone here has applied to the civil service before, but it is not a usual recruitment system. It's very much, you have to practice at your answers in order to get through the SIFT, which is the first stage and then the interview process is also different from a normal recruitment process. It can also take longer than a normal recruitment process. So you have to be, if you really want a job in policy, you have to be prepared to go into it. Yeah, it's a slightly different way. But once you've worked out what they're asking for, it's possible to get a job.
Yeah. So how did you manage that? How did you work out what they were after?
I failed the first time round in my applications. The second time round, DEFRA actually provided some guidance on how to answer the questions, which really helped. Because the first time I applied to DEC, who did not offer guidance. And I think again, you really, once you got the formulation of the answers right, you could then replicate that. I mean, it's not difficult. It's just it's within a very restricted word limit, and ticking all the boxes in that word limit is the trick.
Can I just add something to that? So the research councils are also part of the civil service, and I think if it's the same as what Natalie's talking about, it's all about the civil service key competences. So if you Google civil service key competences answers, you will get some good answers that will give you an idea about what to use. And basically, it's very much like what Sarah talked about earlier in terms of applying for a job. In the job advert, they have to legally tell you what skills they're looking for, and if you can demonstrate those skills in your core competencies examples, of which there are usually like 4 or 5, right? That's how you get the tick to then get through to the next level at interview. So I found that kind of helpful, because also for me, applying for sort of my job at the moment, it sounds like very similar to what Natalie did. And just understanding that because it's civil service, they have to use very particular rules, but actually everything you would need to know is in the job advert. And if you know that the language is civil service core competencies, that really helped. My mum was a civil servant, so she was able to tell me a bit about the core competencies, which certainly helped me. But also Google is your friend with that.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant.
I would say a lot of my job is not much different from doing research, because the policy development aspect of it means that we're gathering evidence and making decisions, which is something that you do in research all the time. So that's the bit I really enjoy, and the critical thinking as well. You have to really analyse what the information that you're getting in order to make that policy recommendation to ministers. The bit that's slightly different is how you then communicate your information to ministers. It's more, it's like a scientific paper, but you do it in a really short and more structured way. And then you have training in this. So as a civil servant, you get 5 days a year for training. A lot of this will be for the sort of core skills initially that you will need to be a civil servant, like drafting and advising ministers, learning about Parliament, things like that, which is really interesting. The extra bit that I guess I didn't have any preparation for was reactive work. So say a minister is going on a visit tomorrow and they suddenly tell you they want briefing today. That's not, the deadlines are not usually so soon, but it can happen, and in which case you have to drop everything you're doing and get to that piece of work, which I think adds an element of excitement and surprise. But you also have that long-running policy development in the background.
Yeah.
I think at my level, the responsibility is actually fairly minimal, and you're only expected to work 9 to 5, which is actually a really nice thing coming from academia, where the expectations are that you work all the time. And you have to enjoy working in a team, and depending on what team you're placed in, there are different dynamics within that team. And I think the thing that surprised me a lot about the civil service is people move around very frequently. So you'll move into a team, you'll get used to your teammates, and then someone will leave. It's very common. Which initially it felt like a drawback, but actually I've adapted now, and it's very enjoyable.
So I'm complete polar opposite to Katherine and Natalie next to me. I suppose I've never really applied for a job or gone through an application process.
Lucky you.
Which is strange, maybe I've got a different way of thinking about the world or looking at different problems, but I suppose I was very, very lucky that my PhD in supermolecular chemistry led to an academic discovery which had some commercial opportunity, and I always wanted to run my own company, and there was an opportunity to set one up. It was fairly loose grounds. There wasn't that much of an idea, but I think I really just wanted to understand how do companies work, how do you set them up, what's that legal process, and that's the reason why me and Tom, my co-founder, decided to do it. We didn't think it would work just to start that. I suppose we never thought Xyla would work at the start. We thought Tom was an actuary, so maths and statistics. He was interested in investment, and we had some interesting research, these glucose binding molecules, and we thought there was applications in glucose sensing, and there ended up being therapeutic applications as well. And we were we wanted to understand how the world works. How do you take an idea and how do you turn it into a commercial product? And in order to do that, you need to raise investment. Why do people give you money? If people give you money, how do you put it into a bank account? How do you set up that legal entity? Why would people want to do that? Why is this important? And I suppose we kind of went into it without any training whatsoever. And I think because of the research PhD that I did in chemistry, that wasn't really that daunting at all. We just went and ordered a load of books on Amazon and read them on how to start a company, what a company is, what are patents, and just started reading and educating ourselves. We formed a company, we wrote a business plan, we negotiated licenses off the university, and we started raising investment, and we started building a company. So that's kind of how we got going. I think it's now kind of morphed into this thing where we're now the journey from academia to start up to potentially a commercial product. At Bristol University was fairly untrodden. I think we were the first chemistry spin out for like 5 or 6 years out of the chemistry department, which was really quite worrying considering how much government money's gone into the chemistry department. And I think we came along at just the right time where there's been this shift now with the REF framework, the Research Excellence Framework, towards impact. We had kind of Innovate UK had not long been going, and really we just we ended up forming our own incubator, which you've heard of, Unit DX, and now I think since opening our doors in 2017, the University of Bristol's had the highest number of spin-outs in its history by 75%, and we've beat that target again this year. I've now turned into an investor. The companies that we've started are still going. So yeah, it's been a pretty crazy journey in the last 4 years. So it's 4 years since I did my PhD. So I think when me and Ben interviewed Sarah, and I think we looked through her application. I just said, oh, this person can do anything, and we just looked at this. It's just like she obviously has the aptitude that you could research a certain area and you can learn that. And I often think with business is that it's access to that information. You need to be able to find the people who've been there and done it before, and it's about these communities and being able to speak to people who have raised investment, who have written grants which are specific to small businesses, what are those differences, and that's really, really key in trying to understand why people want to give you money, and why there's lots of people out there with lots of funds with millions and millions of pounds burning holes in their pockets, and there's lots of very, very good research which has enormous opportunity to be turned into new ideas, and you just need to understand kind of all of those steps in between, and how do you make the system work for yourself. and I think that's what we try to teach at Unit DX is to kind of try and actually get a grip on all of these different problems that you all face if you set a company up. You don't necessarily need to do all of them, but you need to have an appreciation for them, and then you can look at your own skill sets. Like I could never work in the civil service, I'm far too disorganised. But look at your own skill sets, and where would you place within an organisation, and if there's some interesting research that you've got that you're working on, maybe you could be the catalyst in getting that out. But where you fit in that team is really important. I don't do a lot of the science now at Carbometrics. That's run by Dr. Andy Chapman, who's much more competent than I am, which is why I hired him. And yeah, I like to think of, there's been a lot of talk of working in teams, going away from working on individual research projects. And I think that's what companies are. That's what big organisations are. They're a lot of people working together with common goals. So learning how to work as part of teams, looking what your strengths and your weaknesses are, and trying to focus on a career that can cater that's really important. Well, you obviously, everything starts with a piece of technology usually. So it's looking at that technology and what differentiates it from what else is out there. And what's really important is that sort of competitive landscape. What are the other technologies, and what are some of those pitfalls? And in some of those pitfalls, are they holding back certain market opportunities? And that's what's really important to try and understand. Is there a product that everybody's been trying to get to, but nobody's been able to get to it because fundamentally there's something wrong with the base technology, that it's too expensive, so therefore it's never going to be commercially viable. And you can do that by trying to understand, let's say you've got a new process for synthesizing DNA or something like that, benchmarking kind of all of the other technologies, looking at what the applications are, and trying to see also, are there any big sort of events in history where somebody's been bought, someone's been sold, a company's been formed, and can you look at their technology and can you say, have what I've got, is it something differentiated, is it better? And I think that's a really good place to start. And I think we were looking at these glucose binding molecules, which are some of the world's first truly synthetic ones, and we had lots of biology that are in the current CGM project sensors. So if you look on the market at the moment, I think 10% of the self-monitoring of blood glucose is all sort of enzyme-based technology for continuous glucose monitors. There's this problem with the current technology where it doesn't last long enough and it's not accurate enough. And the next step is, can we make the technology cheaper and last longer? And then could all of a sudden we open up type 2 diabetes, and can we open up more of a market? And we've spoke to a lot of companies, and they definitely think that's the case. So I suppose it's looking at that technology. If you are a scientist, you can fundamentally look at the piece of chemistry or biology that is doing that job, and you can compare it to what's out there. And at that stage, it needs to be some sort of careful benchmarking. If it's as good or you're not as good, then that's probably a point to sort of call it a day.
Thanks, Sarah. For those of you who might have missed the earlier bit of my presentation, I'm a business interaction manager for the SRC, which means I work with academic and industry stakeholders to really design and make sure our funding mechanisms are serving the UK bioscience community as well as possible. In terms of the drawbacks of my jobs, well, one thing I find really exciting is being part of an organisation that invests up to £500,000 in bioscience each year. But one of the drawbacks of being part of such a big organisation is that decisions take a really long time. And that's often really frustrating. And I think it's something Natalie sort of alluded to as well in the answer that she gave to this question. So, an academic submits a grant to us. It takes us, our machinery in-house, about 6 months to go through the peer review process, and then the assessment panel, and then final funding sign-off from our council, from the UKRI board, and through several governance levels, and eventually ministerial sign-off. And that takes a really long time. And coming into the civil service, having worked previously in the private sector as a consultant, I found that really frustrating. So I found it really frustrating that it took us 6 months to get this really exciting idea to actually money on the ground. So I'd say that's something that personally I find a little bit frustrating. But I've actually tried to sort of funnel through that frustration into ways to make our mechanisms perhaps a bit more suitable for purpose. So I talked a little bit about one of the funding evaluations I'm doing on our industrial partnership schemes. And something we've noticed through those schemes is small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, aren't really engaging in those schemes really well. And we think probably that's because 6 months is a really long time if you're an SME. If you're an SME, you don't have 6 months to wait. So we're looking at ways in which we could speed up, for example, those particular type of applications and maybe assess them in a slightly different way so we could get the money out the door for those SME collaborative proposals. So that's a big sort of drawback for me in terms of it's so frustrating, why can't we fund them quicker? The reason it has to be so long is because we have to make sure that the UK taxpayers' money is invested wisely. So we have to make sure that there are at least 3 really high quality peer reviews to go through an assessment panel, and we have to go through these layers of sign-off because it's public funding. Whereas if it's a private company, they can take more risk. We have to be careful about the amount of risk that we take and really make sure we fund the excellent science proposals. Mm-hmm. So I think probably the time and the need to be patient is something I've struggled with a little bit.
Yeah.
So SME is a small and medium-sized enterprise. So I think it's less than 100 or 150 employees. You'd probably know more, Harry.
Yeah, I think it's between like 10 and 100,
10
and
and
under that's micro.
SME. I think we can't even get onto the micro ones yet. We're just trying to do the SME ones. So we work really well for big players that have, like the large agrochemical companies like Bayer, Monsanto, that have loads of money and can wait for 6 months. Our funding mechanisms at the moment don't work so well for the smaller companies. So that's something we're looking to encourage. And actually, we've got a spin-out little project going at the moment to try and encourage spin-outs.
Oh, yeah.
So I should talk to you
speak
about
to me because
that.
I've got a lot of BBRSC spin-outs I'm investing in at the moment.
Oh, really? We should talk. So anyway, but the point is it takes a long time for change as well in the civil service. So, the civil service has obviously been around for as long as government has been around for, and has very particular rules and regulations and processes. And if you want to do anything new and innovative, it can take a little while to sort of sometimes break through that ceiling of, oh no, that's the way it's always been done, that's the perfect way to do it. But I think now that we've formed one big research council, there's actually quite a lot of change happening, and I certainly feel really excited about UK research and innovation and the possibility as well to explore more interdisciplinary science. So particularly the interface with chemistry, biology and engineering, and also computer science. There's sort of a lot of opportunity right at the border between science and technology, which I think we're becoming better at investing in now.
Yeah, I wanted to have a quick question on that because that's been the point of UKRI, isn't it? That you're bringing all together the research councils, and I suppose because I always get confused, as you've got like the BBRSC and then the MRC and the EPRSC, and everybody's kind of overlaps with healthcare quite significantly, don't they? And it's all sort of funded separately. And I, as a chemist originally, sort of, how do you kind of, where is that crossover?
One of the reasons UK Research and Innovation was formed is precisely the reason that Harry's just articulated. It's really confusing if you're an academic or an industry in the external community, where on earth you apply for funding. Historically, what's happened is the research councils have fought between themselves to own areas. And what that's actually meant is that certain areas have fell between the gaps. Yeah. So healthcare technology is one of those, because one research, EPSRC is trying to take ownership of it. But agricultural technologies is another one. So BBSRC wanted to own it because it was agriculture, and traditionally we fund a lot of agriculture. EPSRC wanted to own it because a lot of it was about robotics, so that's obviously really engineering. And what happened is there ended up being a bit of a remit fight into who can own a space. Now we're all part, thank goodness, of the same organisation. It's a lot easier now for us to co-fund proposals. So what happens now is if something comes in a healthcare technology, for example, to EPSRC, But there might be a reason for MRC, if it's a healthcare one, to support it, or BBSRC to support it if it's about an underlying biological mechanism, like glucose monitoring.
Right, yeah.
Then it would come to us to co-fund. So what usually happens is the lead research council, the one that it's best suited to, will assess the proposal, and if they think it's suitable for funding, they come to us and say, BBSRC, will you co-fund some of these proposals?
So the Smart Insulin Programme is obviously pure chemistry marrying up with biology, taking a synthetic molecule and attaching it to a biological molecule. I mean, that's like the ultimate grey areas, isn't it?
Indeed, and I say that's one way in which UK research and innovation is much better, because we're much easier to co-fund, because all our budget is the same budget now, whereas we used to have separate budgets for the research councils. We're all one big happy family. But it's easier for us to co-fund now, so hopefully that will improve as we go forwards. That was the main reason the research councils are set up, to better enable that interdisciplinary science. So from my point of view, interacting a lot with academic stakeholders, you get a lot more recognition with a doctor in front of your name. So just having that in your email signature, and also talking to industry as well, there is a certain kudos attached with having a PhD, and it makes it much easier to have interactions with quite high level academic and industry stakeholders. So often you're engaging with quite high principal investigators, professors, associate professors, heads of departments when you're looking at setting up new funding schemes. And it does help if you've had a PhD, because you understand the academic pathway, particularly also if you've got a postdoc to your name. So I think in terms of sort of kudos of a PhD, that certainly helps. In terms of the specific skills, the direct knowledge of diabetes therapeutics, I wouldn't say the direct knowledge has been important. What's been important, as what I tried to articulate in my presentation, has been the transferable skills. So the ability to be able to analyse something in really complicated detail and come to a conclusion at the end of it, which was your thesis. That's actually really similar to looking at data about different funding mechanisms and looking at which is the most effective. It's quite a similar sort of skill pathway. And also having to look at other people's research and how yours fits in with theirs. So I know in my sort of introduction to my PhD, I was looking at what everybody else had done in diabetes therapeutics, and sort of comparing my sort of research challenge with their previously published research. And that's again quite similar to looking at a current research mechanism and what other mechanisms are out there, and how perhaps this new thing we're setting up is different. So I hope that kind of answers that, and I'll pass it on to Natalie for her thoughts.
Sure. So I would say that on recruitment, they're not looking specifically for PhDs, although there are a lot of people in the civil service with PhDs, and I think it's probably because of that element of feeling that they want to make more impact, and the process that you go through in policy to make that impact is quite an academic process. We also hire scientific officers, so they will be people that have come through academia in a scientific background, but again they won't necessarily be placed in a role that is specific to their background, but you will use your transferable scientific skills. As a policy advisor, again, I think it's so useful having been through a PhD and a postdoc, in terms of understanding how to break down a problem, use critical thinking, analysing evidence, analysing data, which we do have the scientific officers to do that, but as a policy advisor it is so much more useful to be able to do it yourself, which I think is why people find it so rewarding, having been done a PhD or a postdoc, and then be in a policy position. You can actually make really solid policy recommendations. I'm not saying that people without a PhD can't, but it does, I think it really helps having that skill set.
So the way that UKRI funding at the moment happens, and it might change in the future, but at the moment UKRI then has a set amount of money that's allocated to each of the research councils. So for BBS, obviously it's about 400 million a year, and the research councils then administer that budget of funding. So at the moment you don't apply to UKRI for funding, you apply to the research council that's most suited to your remit. So for example, we were talking about healthcare technologies, Harry would apply to EPSRC or MRC as his sort of most relevant research councils. If you were, for example, an academic member looking for funding I don't know, in industrial biotechnology, that would be us at BVSRC. Or if you were an industry person looking for funding, that would be Innovate UK, where you'd apply. So UKRI doesn't, so it's the umbrella organisation that includes all the research councils and Research England and Innovate UK, and it's the ultimate budget line in, Her Majesty's Treasury budget line, but actually the money is delivered, assessed and got out the door by the different research councils and Innovate UK. So the grey areas aren't managed specifically by anyone at the moment. I imagine in the future there are going to be interdisciplinary panels that are set up between the research councils, and that's something that's being looked at now. At the moment, it's still kind of business as usual. You direct your grant through to the relevant research council or Innovate UK if you're an industry member.
For academia, for what I was doing was I would collect data, obviously publish papers, and then hope that that was useful. Whereas now what I do is I take the data that in most cases scientists have produced, and then I make it useful in terms of policy recommendations. So I'm making the next step now, which before I had no control over. I was just sort of hoping that someone would find it useful.
Yeah, I think I'd echo what Natalie said a little bit in that in my PhD I felt like a little tiny cog in a massive machine of diabetes research, and I kind of hoped that the 3 publications I did in my PhD would be read by someone, anyone, and be useful. What I do now is, involved in making sure that we get excellent research proposals in. A lot of my role is making sure those are industry relevant as a business interaction manager, and so that's sort of more before the research starts. So the sort of nurturing that little egg of an idea that could have real industry impact in the UK. And then on the other side of things, looking at things we have funded and what impact there's been. And there's sort of an example of best practice from there. So when we see a project that's gone really well, that we really want to talk to the community, we try and look, okay, how did our funding pathway help that project? Is there something we could have done to accelerate that, to get there sooner? So I think in terms of impact, I feel now that I'm involved in not just one little tiny sub-bit of science, but I'm involved in bioscience research in general, according to BVSRC's aims, which I talked about earlier. But I feel like I'm a sort of bigger cog, still in a massive machine that is the civil service, because let's face it, it's huge. But I feel like I'm having more personal impact, and actually I'm being involved in lots of different areas of science. So I personally found my PhD was a bit bored of diabetes research, to be honest, by the end of the 5 years that I'd done it. And I kind of like at the moment that I get to look at impact from lots of different research projects. I enjoy that variety. So, one day I'm working on something to do with wheat, or my current favourite agricultural project, which is looking at cows and how to make them produce more milk when it's snowing, because that is increasingly happening in Scotland. So you've got to make those cows happier. Do we create little huts for them? Do we create little sheds? What do we do? That's my favourite current agricultural project. Or looking at enzymes that can make cool new things, new biopharmaceuticals. So I kind of like the variety in my current job, which I think has, impact from a variety of different types of bioscience than my PhD, which is just this really tiny little thing. Harry?
So I suppose I feel like everything I do is kind of around this impact, around taking research and helping it turn it into something that could ultimately help people. So I have 3 hats. I'm the CEO of Carbometrics, where we're taking the glucose binding platform we deliver that chemistry to Novo Nordisk on the Smart Insulin program. So we are really, really hopeful that one day that's going to lead to one of the world's first smart insulins, which will have an enormous global impact. So we're working incredibly hard to make sure we can deliver our end of the bargain. Within Carbometrics, we're also working on glucose sensors as well, to take that same fundamental platform and to turn it into a new glucose detection platform. So again, there's a big opportunity there, especially around personalised medicine. If you have kind of really easy to get at glucose readings, like what could that be used for kind of moving the current healthcare system forwards. Then the second job, I suppose, is Unit DX, making sure that the building runs, making sure that we have expansion plans. We've filled up in 18 months, and now we've got more spin-outs than we've ever seen, and we're full. So, how do we make sure that there's enough room for everybody? So expansion plans, working with West of England, working with local councils, working with central government in terms of we've generated all of this amazing research. Where's the infrastructure that supports that growth? And are our cities now ready for this sort of new industrial revolution, moving over from the service space industry over to more small companies and research, which is what government wants. How have we changed the planning of our cities to cope with this new boom in small companies? And then finally, it's now looking as a mentor to small companies, as an angel investor, and we're building a portfolio of sort of biotech and hard science companies in Bristol around DEFRA, trying to make sure they get off the ground and ultimately have impactful projects. We generally try to invest in companies which have some kind of societal impact, so that's usually something I personally would be looking to work with.
So I think any new job takes at least 6 months to become competent in. So I think that's like a good stage gate, that give yourself 6 months. Won't be expected to know everything on day one. And actually most people, it's our sort of rule in the office that usually it takes 6 months to really know the job and be able to do it really well, really competently. For me, I've done that switch, sort of academia to private industry, and then academia and now civil service. What are the sort of differences in terms of a mental switch? So in academia, I think you're often left to your own devices for a long time. I mean, my PhD, I checked in with my PI once a week if I was lucky. I mean, if she was on a conference, sometimes it would be much longer than that. I did have a quite supportive lab team, so if there were problems on a day-to-day basis, couldn't get any of my heating plates to work or something like that, there was technical help and support. But in terms of strategy and leadership, I was lucky if that was once a week in a lab meeting. In the civil service, you regularly have a lot of meetings. You saw my diary. Everything that was read in my diary is a lot of meetings. And I think it's quite directive in terms of you have your set job objectives and you know what you need to achieve in the next 6 months, and there are 6-month check-ins on how well you've done, if you need more support or training to help pursue some of those objectives. So I think in the civil service, and also when I was in private enterprise, there was a lot more specific training attached to the job. So you're actually given a lot of help in how to do the job. When I joined UKRI Research and Innovation, I had no idea how to set up a funding call. Had no idea how that worked. Done my PhD and my research experience in New Zealand. Didn't even know, how that landscape worked. But I was given a lot of training in how to do that. So I think for me, the sort of main differences were that in both private practice when I was a consultant and in the civil service, I was given both times an induction programme and quite a lot of extra training. So Natalie talked about the 5 days a year, similar with UK Research and Innovation. And I felt my hand was held a lot more in both my private practice and my public sector job, because they're paying you a good salary, they want you to do a good job, and they really want you to succeed and be able to do that as quickly as possible. So I felt like I was given a lot more specific training, and I found it a lot easier. I found the first year of my PhD really hard. I almost quit after the first year of my PhD. And I did, go on to have a very successful PhD. I, published 3 publications, but I found it really hard because you're dumped into this project that may or may not work. And for me, I tried 5 different synthesis pathways in my first year. The 5th one worked, and I found that quite demotivating. But actually, 5 actually worked really well. And actually, I'd finally got there and I managed to get through the PhD, and actually that was such a good learning experience. And whenever anyone asks me in an interview now about a challenging situation, I'll be like, my first 4 PhD projects didn't work. I had to keep trying until I got to the 5th one, and that did work. And so that sort of perseverance and resilience of character to get through that really has helped me now in my current job. So sorry, it's gone a bit off the point, but you get more training and more hand-holding in private practice and civil service has been my experience. Natalie, you had a similar experience.
Yeah, it depends on what team you go into as well, though. Because if you're managers range so much in the civil service in terms of their approach to managing. My first manager, I found it very strange that within a month he sat me down and said, "So where do you want to be in 3 years' time?" within the civil service? And I don't know, I've only been here a month. But he kept having those conversations with me throughout the 18 months because he really wanted to stretch me where I wanted to be stretched, but he didn't want to overload me. So it was very interesting, like a very different approach in the civil service. And as I say, they're used to people moving a lot, so they expect you to go for promotion opportunities when they come up. But different people have different drivers, so they're not going to push you towards something. It's up to you how you sort of develop on your career path, which I found really different and good. I felt in academia that there was too much expectation of where you would be going, but not much conversation and helping you to reach where you want to go.
How much training have you had, Harry?
Yeah, not much. I think a PhD did similar. Everything didn't work the first time. Just to let you know, there's a lot of stuff that didn't work at all, and it wasn't until the end of the third year that things started working. Actually,
God,
when I generated all my results in like 6 months.
It's a very familiar story.
So I think that perseverance, and you get to a point where I think it is quite difficult, I think, sometimes with PhD projects, but at the end of it, you do come out with this sort of resilience. I think that was transferable over to working with Xylo. Definitely, absolutely. But I think, there wasn't much training. I suppose I've had a great team around me. I've gone out and sought after that information. Rather than relying on it being given to me, I've gone out and found that information. Yeah. So we've got a fantastic chairman who's experienced in corporate, structured finance. I have a professor who's on the board of the company. We have links to things like Set Squared. We've spoke to loads of people in industry. You slowly build a picture up of how the world works, and how do you want to achieve your mission. But I think to have a clear kind of mission, what are you trying to do, and then you go out and you source that information. But I didn't have hardly any training whatsoever during a PhD. It was just get in the lab, maybe some good postdocs and the group, and some great conversations with Tony. But other than that, it was just working out yourself.
Great.
Oh, there was a range of things. My research area was very expensive. You had to get a lot of funding to. So I was measuring rare earth element isotopes in microscopic shells from the bottom of the ocean, and it required a multi-collector mass spectrometer and a clean lab. And if I was to go and set up this myself, it was a very daunting task, and I felt that my drive to answering the questions in my research was not there in order to warrant going out there and trying so hard to make it work. And actually I was excited by the other opportunities that, and the other jobs that were out there. Once I started looking on job websites, I thought, wow, there's some really interesting things that I could do. And I wasn't sort of so married to my academic, like my scientific questions that I wanted to answer, that I didn't want to stay within that field. I felt like there was so much variety and other questions that I could answer, that it wasn't actually difficult. The difficulty for me leaving academia was just the unknown element of what am I going into in terms of what's going to be expected of me in my job, and how do I go about my day-to-day job? How do I get this job that I don't quite know what it is? That was a lot more daunting to me than actually leaving academia behind.
Harry? Why did you leave academia?
Well, I think that I could have done a postdoc, I suppose, because. Well, I wanted to stay in research, and I think there's a common theme here with all of us. We're sort of passionate about the underlying science and the impact that can do. And I think, for me, I thought that it was important that someone tried to take